My name is John Mack. I'm Director of Public Programs here at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. I'd like to thank you for joining us tonight. We are now in the 30th sort of framework of days that we're in this conference center. We're basically in month 2, so pardon us while we kind of still work out the kinks, but we are getting there, and it's starting to feel like a functional place, so thank you for coming. For nearly a century, the Chicago Council on Global Affairs has provided an independent, nonpartisan platform for a variety of different voices to promote deeper global understanding and active U.S. engagement in the world. Views expressed by individuals we host are their own and do not represent institutional positions or views of the Council. Tonight's conversation is on the record, and we are live streaming, so feel free to tweet, take pictures, Instagram, but please do it silently and turn off your phone, the ringers and notifications. We're delighted tonight to feature Eric Schlosser, the author of Fast Food Nation and Reefer Madness, to discuss the challenges and risks of the nuclear age we are living in. We're also fortunate to have Emma Belcher, Director of the Nuclear Challenges Program at the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, to take part in the conversation. The topic of nuclear weapons and U.S. national security remains a top 5 critical threat for Democrats, Republicans, and independents, according to the 2016 Chicago Council survey that we released just this morning in D.C. That live stream is online and the report is available to download. Although nuclear accidents are rare, nuclear weapons include complex technological systems, and even a simple error can lead to a disaster. Eric has spent considerable time researching and exploring our nuclear control systems and will leave us all with a clearer picture of what is working and what isn't. His research led to the 2013 release of his book, Command and Control, and that book has grown into a documentary that will see its Chicago premiere at the Siskel Film Center on Friday. Eric, Emma, and my former colleague Rachel Bronson, now the Executive Director of the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, will discuss the film following the 8 p.m. showing at the Siskel Center. I'd also like to thank the MacArthur Foundation and PBS's American Experience for their partnership tonight. And we will begin our program by watching a short trailer for the film, and then Emma will lead the conversation with Eric before we turn to the audience for your questions. Thank you.
I was fairly new to working out on the missile sites. Right above us was a 9-megaton thermonuclear warhead. It was a monster waiting to go off. You think about working on a weapon of mass destruction, you're counting on everything to work perfect all the time. And things just don't work perfect all the time.
From the very beginning of the atomic age, there has been a sense of this immense power just being on the verge of slipping out of our control.
The warhead on top of the Titan II was 3 times as powerful as all the bombs used in the Second World War, including both the atomic bombs.
Sheriff, has the Air Force told you very much?
They haven't told me a darn thing.
Does that make you mad?
Yes, it does.
We got a potential nuclear explosion 46 miles from here. If that warhead explodes, Little Rock's gone. Do we let the world know? What do you do?
This is your warning. Help me! For me.
The governor of the state of Arkansas is Bill Clinton.
As regards a nuclear explosion, all we can do is to trust the experts.
Is there a warhead on the site?
I cannot confirm or deny.
The Air Force is telling people it's not happening.
Before September 18th,
This is just an nightmare.
the only warheads that we thought would go off in the United States would be Soviet. We never considered our own warheads could detonate on our own continent.
Nuclear weapons are machines, and every machine ever invented
This is
eventually goes wrong.
Hello. So as John mentioned before, Command and Control is playing at the Siskel this week, and I'd highly encourage any of you who were sort of intrigued by that trailer, as I'm sure you were, to go and see it. Tomorrow night at the 8 p.m. showing, we'll have a screening, and Eric and Rachel Bronson and I will be there to have a short discussion afterwards. So I'd highly encourage people to check that out if you're interested in seeing the film. So before we launch into questions with Eric, I thought I'd just provide a little bit of context for the current situation. So today there are over 15,000 nuclear weapons in the world, vast majority held by the United States and Russia. And while we are down dramatically from the number of weapons during the height of the Cold War, between 60 and 70,000, dangers really still persist. And many experts, a number of them are quite worried that the danger now is worse than it was during the Cold War, at the end of the Cold War. More countries have nuclear weapons, a number are adding to their arsenal, and you've got the non-state actor threat that makes today's situation particularly dangerous. Yet the fear seems to have sort of receded from the public mind. It's an existential threat, but people really associate that with the Cold War and a former era. So while it's an existential threat, it's receded from public imagination. So my question to Eric is, what drove you to work on nuclear weapons, coming from working on, taking on the fast food industry? What led you to work on command and control?
Well, I guess the glib answer would be I'm interested in things that are bad for you. And nuclear weapons would certainly fit into that category. I was spending time with the Air Force. I was interested in the future of warfare in space. And most people don't realize that we have a US Space Command and an Air Force Space Command. And their headquarters are in Colorado Springs, Colorado, which is where Fast Food Nation was set. So I was spending time visiting their bases, and I was just curious about this argument that the next war between developed nations, the real battlefield will be in space. And it turns out that a lot of the officers in the Air Force Space Command began their careers as launch officers in missile complexes like the one you saw in the trailer, and ICBM complexes. And it was a logical career path. If you had dealt with missiles, you would be better equipped to deal with the future of warfare in space. So when we weren't talking about laser beam weapons and directed energy beam weapons and the sort of things they're worried about destroying satellites, they started telling me stories from the Cold War and stories involving nuclear weapons and nuclear weapons accidents. And one of the officers told me the story of the accident that's at the center of my book and the focus of this documentary, which was a nuclear weapons accident in Damascus, Arkansas, involving the most powerful warhead that we ever built, that a very simple mistake set into motion a chain of events that could have led to its detonation in Arkansas, which really would have changed the course of history. This warhead was 600 times more powerful than the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima, and 3 times more powerful than all the bombs used by all the armies in the Second World War combined, including both atomic bombs. So I was amazed that I never heard that story. And I guess I just went down the rabbit hole. And the more I investigated that accident, I then heard about other accidents, other close calls, other occasions when we came close during the Cold War to having a nuclear war with the Soviet Union. And it just seemed like this extraordinarily important subject that nobody was talking about anymore. So what I've tried to do with the book and with the film is tell an interesting story. I mean, the film is supposed to work like a techno-thriller, except it's a techno-thriller in which nothing works. And try to remind people that these machines are out there and the consequences of something going wrong.
What do you say to people who say, well, nothing's happened, really? The last nuclear weapons that were used were in war were 1945,
yeah.
And there haven't been major nuclear incidents, so therefore, you know, the concern about nuclear weapons is overblown.
I'd say to them that the people who know the most about nuclear weapons are the most concerned about one of them being used. And last night in Palo Alto, I was with former Secretary of Defense Bill Perry, who is not an emotional, unstable person prone to exaggeration. He's an extraordinary public servant. He is very level-headed, and he thinks that the danger of a nuclear weapon destroying a city is greater today than it was during the Cold War, for some of the reasons you said. The fact that terrorists might try to get hold of a weapon or make a weapon, the fact that there are now regional rivalries like the one between India and Pakistan that are highly unstable, that you have two nuclear-armed states that had a border skirmish just a couple of weeks ago. So some of the most important, articulate, and profound sources for my book were people in their 80s and even early 90s who had been involved in nuclear weapons design, who had worked at the Pentagon in charge of our nuclear war plans, who had been in the Air Force in the Strategic Air Command in charge of nuclear weapons. And it's this just unusual thing. When I was in college in the 1980s, there was a very strong anti-nuclear movement on college campuses. There was a nuclear freeze movement. The biggest political demonstration in American history, some people believe, was the anti-nuke demonstration in 1982 in Central Park that attracted almost 1 million people. So those who were the most anti-nuclear when I was in my late teens and early 20s were my contemporaries. And it's this odd thing that the most anti-nuclear advocates today are in their 80s and even in their early 90s because they understand this subject. And the people who are, I mean, it's remarkable, but if you're a freshman in college right now, you were born 7 years after the Soviet Union vanished. So there's a remarkable amount of historical amnesia. And to me, the greatest danger in some ways aren't these weapons. The greatest danger is the lack of concern, lack of awareness, and I think an enormous complacency about these weapons.
Right. Give us a little bit of insight into the process of doing your research. And you mentioned a number of people that you spoke to and provided insight. But how did you go about your research? And in the past, it seems that you've spent time with migrant workers and you've spent time with the NYPD. How do you immerse yourself in the nuclear world? What's the sort of equivalent?
This book was really hard. It really was hard for me because, I mean, there's this saying, it's not rocket science, but this really was rocket science. So I felt like I had to master the science behind these Titan II missiles, which were the focus of the main narrative of the book. I had to really study nuclear weapons design. And I tried very hard to provide an alternate history of the Cold War. Most of the books on the Cold War and on nuclear weapons are about the high-level diplomacy, about the SALT, arms control talks. And I spent an enormous amount of time in some ways doing a history from the bottom up with the maintenance crews who worked on the missiles, with the nuclear weapon repairmen whose job it was to take care of the weapons designers, the pilots and navigators of B-52s. And their stories really hadn't been told before. And a major part of the book is about the heroism and sacrifice of a lot of ordinary military personnel who risked their lives and sometimes lost them trying to prevent a nuclear catastrophe or a nuclear war. So I thought the book was going to be a relatively short book that would take about a year and a half, and it wound up to be a much longer book that took about 6 years because I kept on finding so much information that just hadn't been published before. I did Freedom of Information Act searches on a lot of the documents pertaining to nuclear weapon safety and nuclear weapon design, and some of these things took 2-3 years just to get back. And so it was, I mean, I enjoyed it, and I'm not complaining about it, but it was the most difficult thing that I've ever written.
And what was the most surprising thing to you that you sort of uncovered?
One of the central themes of the book is about technology, not just nuclear weapons. It's about complex technological systems. And what I realized is that as human beings, we're much better at creating them than we are at controlling them or knowing what to do about them when something goes wrong. And so the most surprising thing for me was to find again and again how remarkably trivial events or remarkably trivial mistakes can have profound consequences. The Damascus accident, the accident at this Titan II complex in Arkansas, that's the central narrative of the book, it occurred because a workman dropped a socket in a missile silo, and the socket took a freak bounce, hit the missile, caused a fuel leak with this incredibly powerful nuclear warhead on top of it. But there was another accident at a Minuteman missile site in which there was a problem with the intruder alarm, basically the burglar alarm, make sure that no one was breaking into the site. So a workman went out to the Minuteman missile silo and opened up the fuse box and was testing the fuses, but he'd forgotten to bring a fuse puller, and he was using a screwdriver, just testing the fuses. And he pulled out one of the fuses, and he heard a loud explosion, and the warhead had been blown off the top of the missile in the silo. There was another instance in which the navigator of a B-52 bomber was going on a long, they had these airborne alert bomber flights in the early 1960s. The film Dr. Strangelove and another film, Failsafe, were about these flights in which B-52s would fly for 24 hours loaded with nuclear weapons, waiting to attack the Soviet Union. And before one of these long flights, the navigator, because it was just a really uncomfortable plane to be on for 24 hours, brought a few rubber seat cushions to make it more comfortable to take a nap during the flight. And he stowed the seat cushions beneath the navigator seat and didn't realize that he put the seat cushions next to a heat vent. And these foam cushions caught on fire and downed the plane. And the plane crashed with 4 hydrogen bombs. And those hydrogen bombs were later found to be very vulnerable to accidental detonation. And the plane crashed near one of our most top secret military installations, a radar base in Greenland that we believed would be the first thing to be destroyed if the Soviet Union were going to attack us. If the Soviet Union were going to attack us, we thought the radar base at Thule in Greenland would be wiped out, and that would be the signal that we were at war. Now, it's amazing to think that we could have had an accidental nuclear war because somebody brought 3 rubber seat cushions onto a plane. So the most surprising thing is again and again how events that are almost impossible to anticipate and really trivial ones can have catastrophic impact when you're dealing with a technology like nuclear weapons.
How did your experience writing the book then lead to the film?
Yeah. For all of the things that I've written, it's hard enough to write something, and I'm really focused on the writing of it. And I try to write something that is worth reading from the upper left-hand corner of the first page to the lower right-hand corner of the last page. And I'm not thinking about could it be a film or would it be a film. And for the book that I'm working on right now, which is about the American prison system, I've been approached for years now about a film based on this book, but I'm very adamant about I want to write the book that I want to write, and then if there's a filmmaker interested in making a film on it, we can talk about that later. So I focused on the writing of the nuclear weapon book, and then Robert Kenner is a documentary director that I work closely with on a film, Food Inc., that was partly based on Fast Food Nation, and he read the book and was interested in doing a documentary based on command and control. And at that point is when the discussion of how to make it into a film began.
You've mentioned your concern not about the weapons themselves as much as the sort of complacency, potentially lack of awareness. How do you see the sort of relationship between art and media and films and educating people and raising awareness and potentially affecting change?
Yeah. I started out as a fiction writer, as a playwright and as a novelist, and I came to writing nonfiction relatively late, I mean in my early 30s. And so when I started writing nonfiction, I didn't want to write agitprop, and I didn't want to write something that was just an angry screed. And I won't mention any names, but there are some writers who write about issues of the moment, and they write about it in a very didactic and very dogmatic way. I really have set out to try to write things that are complex, to write things that are open to different interpretations, that don't have obvious good guys and bad guys, because I think that's what corresponds most closely to reality. So if there is a strong critique that runs through most of my work, it's a critique of systems and not a demonization of individuals. Even when I was very tough on McDonald's, I wasn't, holding up the chief executive as a terrible person. So I think that my job as a writer, firstly, is to write something that's interesting to read and that is pleasurable to read, and that's hard. But then also to write something that treats the reader with respect and respects his or her intelligence. But what I'm really trying to do is provoke thought, not tell people what to think.
Right.
I have found in my own family and with my own friends, I cannot tell them successfully what to think. So the notion of telling total strangers what to think is unappealing. And just to wrap up, the writers who I really admired growing up were writers who threw themselves into the big issues of the day and tried to address those issues. So I think it's something that writers and filmmakers and artists and people in the media have a great opportunity to do. When I first came up with the idea for Fast Food Nation, I wrote it as an article for Rolling Stone, and I wanted very much to do it as a book, and none of the New York City publishers were interested in my writing a book, Fast Food Nation. And I got the same rejection again and again, which is that nobody wants to read a book about food, and the only food books that will sell are books that have recipes. And it's been very gratifying, and I'm not taking credit for it. I'm just saying I've watched the process of how change can happen, is that if you go into a bookstore now, there are amazing books about our food system. There are new books coming out every year. And so, you can be part of changing the culture. And I would never claim to be solely responsible for it in any way. And what I've done with all my books is had very lengthy footnotes and source notes and acknowledgments, which is a way of my honoring all those who've done work on this subject before me. It's a way of making my work transparent, because so many of the subjects I've written about are about, powerful institutions are trying to cover things up. So I've made my work transparent, but I also do it so that the next writer who wants to write about this subject can have a resource of where I got all this stuff. And I'm hoping on the nuclear weapons issue that there will be many more books and many more films, because that's how things begin to change in the culture.
So on this topic, maybe this is not so much a question, but what role do you see for the public in sort of addressing the issue of nuclear risk?
The same role that the public is now playing in addressing climate change. The same role the public played in getting marriage equality. All of these are important issues, and the public can play a huge role in affecting change. You talk about the influence of works of art. Ronald Reagan was elected president as an ardent Cold Warrior, dedicated to greatly increasing the size of our nuclear arsenal, and two films had a huge impact on him. One was a film called The Day After, which was a made-for-television movie about what would happen to the United States after a nuclear attack. He saw it at the White House, and it scared the hell out of him. There was another film, War Games, which was about, Matthew Broderick as a young hacker getting into our computer system and maybe prompting a nuclear war. And the other thing that happened was, as I mentioned, this massive anti-nuclear movement, not just in the United States, but throughout Europe. Millions of people marched. And by the time Reagan left office, he was genuinely and sincerely committed to abolishing nuclear weapons. And I think that the end of the Cold War was able to occur peacefully because both Gorbachev and Reagan listened to public opinion worldwide, and people were afraid of a nuclear war and demanded that the risk be reduced.
And I guess you talk about these times and movements that were in the past, and you've also referred before, I believe, to a sort of a collective historical amnesia about the risk. How do you demonstrate the risk to people in a way that is poignant and salient, yet doesn't scare people, make them want to run a mile away?
Yeah.
Thoughts on that?
It's a challenge. It is a challenge. And I think that the book and the film that's been based on the book try to get your attention, but it's sort of remarkable, but I'm now 9 years into this subject. It took 6 years to do the book, and then the book came out in 2013, and with the making of the documentary and traveling around talking about nuclear weapons, I've now been immersed in the subject for 9 years. And I'm not depressed. I'm not medicated. I don't think that we're all doomed. I'm not apocalyptic, but I'm concerned. And I really do believe that nuclear weapons and global warming are the two existential threats that we face. Global warming is occurring relatively slowly, but the detonation of a nuclear weapon will be instantaneous and irreversible, and I think it's preventable. And so rather than feel overwhelmed, I think people need to become aware and then take action. And maybe I'm hopeful or optimistic by nature because I have written about a lot of dark subjects, the exploitation of migrant workers and meatpacking workers, and yet when people talk to me and they express, well, aren't you overwhelmed, or there's this sense that you can be overwhelmed by it, and one of the ways not to be overwhelmed is to do something. And the feeling of doing something, it helps considerably. And I've been involved in so many different campaigns as an activist since Fast Food Nation came out, and so many of them have ended in terrible defeat. But it's this sense of, you lose, you lose, you lose, you lose, and then you win. And I'm sure that's how it felt for a lot of anti-nuclear activists and a lot of supporters of American foreign policy when the Soviet Union vanished peacefully and Eastern Europe was liberated peacefully. But these kinds of mammoth changes, or even in my lifetime, the other mammoth change that occurred was the end of apartheid in South Africa. I mean, when I was in university, it was inconceivable that apartheid would end without a race war, or that Nelson Mandela would be released from Robben Island prison and be best friends with a warden of the prison and be president of a free South Africa. So things that seem unlikely in a good way can occur, but they don't just happen. People need to be aware, and then they need to do something.
We're nearing the end of the Obama presidency, and in President Obama we had someone who felt very strongly about nuclear weapons and sort of laid out a vision of getting rid eventually of nuclear weapons, perhaps not in his lifetime, laid out an agenda. And we've seen progress on that agenda, and Perhaps there's further that he would have liked to have gone. If you had 5 minutes with him, what would you say to him?
Bravo. I am amazed at the dignity and grace with which he has behaved in the face of unrelenting, vicious, and racist attacks since the beginning of his administration. And there are some people who are quite critical of him for not having done more to get closer to a world without nuclear weapons. But I don't feel that sort of criticism. He gave a wonderful speech in Prague in 2009 calling for a world without nuclear weapons. And politically, he put himself here. And American popular opinion is across the street. And in order for the President of the United States to make those sorts of meaningful changes, there needs to be a movement. There needs to be popular support for those sorts of actions. What was quite remarkable to me is after getting that first arms control deal signed with Russia, he then called for further reduction in the arsenals of the United States and Russia. And he was viciously attacked by the Republican Congress for being weak, and he was ridiculed by the Russians, who said that we're not going to reduce the number of warheads any further. So I think perhaps if there had been a Democratic Congress from 2010 onward, there would have been more progress on this issue. We have this extraordinary modernization plan that's now getting going that will cost $1 trillion over the next 30 years to modernize all three legs of our nuclear triad, the submarines, the missiles, the bombers. But that was a deal that he had to make in order to get this arms control agreement signed. So I think he's an imperfect man, but I don't imagine there'll be a greater president in my lifetime.
So you'd say bravo.
I'd say bravo.
Would you put in a plug for what he should do in his remaining time?
And I would say, once you're out of office, let this be one of the core issues that you devote your time to, because it could not be more important.
Great. Well, on that note, I'd like to open it up to audience questions. So please raise your hand, and someone will come around with the microphone. You could just let us know your name. And the gentleman in the blue shirt, yes?
Charlie Didrikson. I don't know if it was Obama or before him that agreed to give money from our budget to Russia to decommission thousands or tens of thousands of their weapons in order, because we didn't think they would spend the money or whatever. Is that what Putin was talking about last week, about getting back in our face, about stopping that program, or am I mistaken?
It was related to that program. There was an enormous amount of plutonium left over from the Soviet weapons program. And we made an agreement that we would take a lot of that plutonium and bring it to the United States and process it in a way that it couldn't be used for nuclear weapons again. And due to some of the bureaucratic incompetence in the Department of Energy, there was a facility that was supposed to have been built in South Carolina that was going to process this plutonium. And the price tag just kept on going up and up and up, and we never built the facility. So it was a way of getting back in our face. This is a very simplistic explanation, and maybe you can correct me if I've made any mistakes. But we had not built the plant. It's called the MOX plant that we were supposed to build to deal with this plutonium. And cooperation has broken down on so many levels between the United States and Russia on nuclear matters that this was just one more area in which cooperation has broken down. You want to add anything to that?
What I would add is that I think we've seen over the last couple of years the real deterioration in US-Russia relations. And there have been programs, in addition to the sort of plutonium disposition agreement between the US and Russia, that focused on, at the end of the Cold War, the fall of the Soviet Union, cooperative programs to help prevent the sort of the weapons and the material from either sort of falling into the wrong hands, to make sure that they were secure as possible within Russia and former Soviet states. So there was this sort of cooperative work, and there was money that the US spent to help Russia to sort of secure its sort of, I guess, a broader sort of nuclear arsenal and complex, because it was viewed as in the interests of both the United States and Russia. So there was really terrific cooperation, particularly between scientists in both countries, between policymakers and officials. And that really has eroded over the last number of years. And I think we see too that Putin has wanted to see Russia seen more on an equal footing with the United States. So whereas at the beginning of those programs, it was more the United States potentially as a sort of a patron or someone coming in, giving money to Russia to help out. But then in the sort of the vision, I think that Russia wants to be seen as more as an equal partner, not sort of taking money from the United States. So it is quite complex over the last number of years. There have been a number of agreements where cooperation has really fallen by the wayside. And I think when you look at the announcements that Putin has made in the last several days, a lot of them seem to be reflecting a reality that has started to happen a few years ago, where for a number of reasons, cooperation has broken down. And this is more, I think, formalizing that sort of, that end to that kind of cooperation. So we are definitely in a new era, and it's distressing in a way, not just because of the inherent dangers, I think, but because the cooperation was so good, particularly on a subject like preventing nuclear terrorism, where that's in the interest of everybody, and it's not such a politically highly charged issue as the number of weapons that you have and disarmament and all the rest. So it is a shame, but it's really, I think, reflective of the current reality that we're in at the moment.
And what's particularly sad about it is the breakdown in cooperation between the United States and Russia on this issue has, been paralleled by a breakdown in Congress in cooperation between Democrats and Republicans on this issue. I mean, the program that Emma was talking about is the Nunn-Lugar Program, in which Senator Sam Nunn, a Democrat, and Richard Lugar, a Republican, worked very closely on an issue of profound importance for everybody, which is locking up the nuclear weapons and the fissile material in the former Soviet Union and removing weapons from states that are no longer, countries that are no longer part of the Soviet Union. And it was a remarkable diplomatic achievement in an international sense, but also a bipartisan achievement in which people put the interests of this country ahead of the interests of their party.
Why don't you say that again so everyone can hear? Yeah.
I'm Joe Locke. I'm a physicist who's a emeritus from Fermilab. But at some point, we were using the Illinois reactors, which I think we may be still using about half of our energy from reactors. That was fueled by the reprocessed Russian plutonium. There's still a huge amount of it that we have and they have, and it does nobody any good.
Yeah.
I think one thing I'd add to that too is, I believe maybe it was about 10 years ago, statistic about 1 in every 10 US light bulbs was fueled by Russian material that had sort of been in weapons pointed at the United States, in a remarkable sort of technical policy innovation. Yeah.
Oh, when Ronald Reagan, our official policy was we must learn to wage and win a nuclear war. And there was, you were talking about building your fallout shelters. You were talking about how do we get people out of the cities in 20 minutes? And it was nonsense. And that was crazy. I was also same class as Carl Sagan at the University of Chicago. And Carl's ideas of nuclear winter. And, those sort of went away, but they're coming back now. And that's what's, you got to keep at it.
Thank you. So you had a question just over. Oh.
Thank you. Could you go into some more specifics on specifically who the threats come from? For example, 10 years ago, a lot of talk about suitcase bombs, things of this sort. The nuclear fission being spread about. What kind of weapons are we talking about? What kind of delivery systems? We tend to focus on the Cold War images, but what are the actual natures of the threat today, and how does command and control come into play?
Well, there are a number of threats. There still are hundreds of missiles in the United States and in Russia that are ready to be launched at a moment's notice. And they are connected to intricate early warning and communication systems that are vulnerable to error. It's quite concerning that Russia no longer has any early warning satellites, which they had in the later part of the Cold War. So their early warning system has pretty much collapsed. It's based on ground-based radar, and that could create a very unstable situation in a crisis. Our own arsenal is aging. The Minuteman missile, which is our principal land-based missile, it was put into the ground in 1970. It was supposed to be retired in the early 1980s. It's an aging weapon system. So command and control looks at the possibility of nuclear accidents, of nuclear war by mistake, which sounds like an impossible thing. It's a low probability thing, but it's not an impossible thing. And if you were to statistically say, what is the most likely source today of the destruction of a city by a nuclear weapon, it would probably be the confrontation between India and Pakistan, where we hated the Soviet Union, but we hated them from a distance of 6,000 miles. And our quarrel with them was ideological. And there were power struggles over Europe, but there's something about the hatred between neighbors that can be much more intense, particularly when neighbors have different ethnic and religious backgrounds. And in the book, I look at some of the false alarms that we had during the Cold War when there were indications, for example, of an all-out Soviet attack on the United States, and it turned out that someone had inadvertently put a training tape into the computer at NORAD in Cheyenne Mountain. There was another all-out attack. It turned out there was a failure of a computer chip in one of our early warning computers. But it would have taken from the Soviet Union, from the landmass of the Soviet Union, about a half hour for a missile to deliver a warhead to the United States. So you'd have 20 minutes to figure out, is this a real missile launch? Is this a mistake with one of the sensors? With India and Pakistan, the flight time of a missile might be as little as 5 or 6 minutes, which puts an enormous pressure on both sides to be the first one to use nuclear weapons, because whoever shoots first has a better chance of winning a nuclear war. So that would be an area where there is a higher probability of the use of a nuclear weapon. And now there are terrorist groups in the world that are celebrating the slaughter of civilians, that are celebrating the destruction of buildings and monuments of great cultural importance. And a nuclear weapon would be the most efficient means of creating that kind of destruction. So there's concerns about the security of the Pakistani arsenal, about a terrorist or an insider getting hold of one of those nuclear weapons. But it's also possible to fabricate a nuclear weapon relatively easily if you have the fissile material and if you don't mind going up in flames when the bomb does. Anything you'd like to add?
No.
A year ago, there was the German airline pilot who was flying, I guess, from someplace in Europe to another place. And he intentionally committed suicide with that plane. He had gone through all of the training, and I guess look in details, maybe he wasn't that emotionally stable, but this was a person who could and did kill a couple hundred people intentionally. Now, how many people have control of a nuclear weapon somewhere? And what are the chances that some of these guys, or maybe even women, at all times are not emotionally stable? I think we've been so lucky in getting away with this, but that to me is a really unstable situation, especially now when, as you say, the controls are not, things are in flux. But it's a scary business.
Well, you know, for most of the Cold War, there were no locks on our nuclear weapons. And what that meant is up until the mid-1970s, if the two launch officers in one of those missile complexes had decided to launch their missile, there was nothing to prevent them from doing that. If a bomber crew had wanted to take off and drop its hydrogen bombs on the Soviet Union, there was nothing to prevent them from doing that. What prevented them during the Cold War was the professionalism and the esprit de corps of our military. But there were always concerns about the psychological well-being of those who were around nuclear weapons. And we established something called the Personnel Reliability Program that really was a series of psychological tests and background checks that you'd have to pass if you could be anywhere near one of our nuclear weapons. And that exists to this day. And one of the questions we have to ask is, would our presidential candidates pass those tests?
All right, next question. There are a few people over here. Yes.
Related to the commercial use of nuclear power, and right now we have quotas in place from Russia about how much nuclear material they can sell to the United States, US-based companies. Would increasing perhaps our trade with Russia do you feel encourage more downblending of weapons to be used in reactors? And I'm not talking about the plutonium necessarily for the MOX facilities, but specifically warheads that they have that they may want to turn into cash and sell to us.
I don't think so. I think that they have so much plutonium to sell, and the warheads that they have, I think they really like having as warheads. What would encourage them to reduce the number of warheads is a change in the relationship between the United States and Russia, and an acknowledgement that we may have very different political systems, we may have very different cultures, we don't have to love one another. But the question we have to ask is, right now, right at this moment, why are we threatening to annihilate the civilian population of Russia, and why are they threatening to annihilate our civilians? What is really the grievance between these two countries that they are existing essentially, it's essentially a gun to the head of one another. And there are other countries in the world that really don't like one another, that don't have thousands of nuclear weapons poised to be used against one another. I mean, we mentioned these Minuteman missiles. We have 440 Minuteman missiles right now. Their only possible use is against Russia. The way that they're situated in the plains, the only other country they could hit would be China, but you'd have to fly over Russia, and Russia probably wouldn't like that. So I think the number of warheads on both sides is going to go down as there's a recognition on both sides that this nuclear standoff and the prospect of another nuclear arms race really doesn't serve either country well.
Here, woman in the purple and pink.
Thank you very much for this program this evening, and I have often long had a question about how do we square philosophically our ability to be able to have nuclear armaments and Russia to be able to have nuclear armaments, but let's say Iran, we don't want you to, or North Korea, we don't want you to, but where do we come across saying that we can, and then if we can't, isn't this just going to be an escalation and proliferation of nuclear armaments around the world?
We signed a treaty in 1969 under President Nixon, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. And the aim of the treaty was to reduce the threat of a nuclear war worldwide. And the countries that did not have nuclear weapons promised never to get them, and in return would be able to have nuclear power. And the countries that under the treaty were allowed to have nuclear weapons promised to work towards disarmament and work towards the complete abolition of nuclear weapons. So by treaty, we're obligated to be working towards that. I guess the only common sense response that I could give is that the fewer nuclear weapons there are in the world, and the fewer countries have them, the less likely they are to ever be used, and the less likely there is to be a catastrophic accident with one of them. So if I were to be speaking to the leadership of Iran, who might make that sort of argument, why can the United States have them and Iran can't? I would respond, how is your country going to be safer by having nuclear weapons? There's the issue of Israel having nuclear weapons. Is Israel more likely or less likely to attack you with a nuclear weapon if you have nuclear weapons or if you don't? The answer, I think, would be if Iran had a few nuclear weapons, they would be much more likely to be attacked by nuclear weapons. And so we have to, there's something called the nuclear, I can't remember the name of the academic who came up with the phrase, the nuclear taboo.
Nina Tannenwald.
There we go. No nuclear weapon has been used against a city since Nagasaki in 1945. And the horror of those destruction of those two cities has prevented anyone from using them since. So we need to strengthen the nuclear taboo. We need to strengthen the notion that civilians are unacceptable targets in warfare. And when you think about nuclear weapons, they're machines, they're technology, and they really embody the values of the era in which they were created. When we invented the atomic bomb, we were destroying dozens, eventually I think 200 Japanese cities with firebombs. There had been the destruction of great European cities by the Axis powers and by the Allied powers. The deliberate targeting of civilians was considered acceptable in warfare. And after the Second World War, it was declared unacceptable. And the military in the United States today, you can be critical of our drone warfare policy and how it's being used, but the whole emphasis in the American military today is on precision weapons that minimize the harm to civilians, and drones are justified on that basis. And nuclear weapons are really only useful for slaughtering large numbers of civilians. So our having them ultimately cannot be justified, but the only way to get rid of them is to incrementally, logically, rationally get rid of them.
The question that I would raise is rationally, but at any rate, thank you for your answer.
I was shocked and intrigued by your answer a few minutes ago about the fact that two missile launch officers could have launched a missile in the 70s on their own accord. What's happened since then in the United States? How tight is the command and control? Is the president really the only person in the country that could possibly unleash a nuclear weapon? And if you know anything about other countries' command and control systems, how tight is the control of the head of government of other nuclear powers in those countries?
Well, during the Cold War, the legal authority that rests only with the President of the United States to use nuclear weapons was delegated quite widely in the United States. And there was a fear that if there was a decapitation attack on Washington and the President was killed, that we wouldn't be able to use our weapons. So It even went down to a relatively low level in NATO, where NATO had tactical weapons, and if they were being overrun by Soviet forces, local commanders were authorized to use their nuclear weapons. Since the Cold War, we've gotten rid of almost all of those tactical weapons. We now have coded switches and locks on our nuclear weapons, and the code is only to be given by the President of the United States. The commanders of our nuclear submarines have the capability independently, as do the commander of the British Trident submarines, to use their nuclear weapons. And it's part of the whole nuclear strategy of there has to be a survivable retaliation. And if your enemy knows that some of those weapons can be used in retaliation if you kill the president, that's part of nuclear deterrence. So I think that there's a safe that has the keys on an American submarine, and then there's another safe that has the code to open the safe that has the keys. And you're supposed to get the code to open the safe with a code from the president. But if you don't get the code from the president, I'm sure on that submarine they can figure out a way to open up the safe. The real concern that I have in the 21st century with all of these systems, and it sounds like the plot of a terrible Hollywood movie, but it's something that people much more experienced than I am are concerned about, is a cyber threat. The NSA is responsible for generating the launch codes. The NSA is responsible for the encryption devices that decrypt the launch codes. And we now have had 2 relatively low-level private contractors at the NSA who've been able to get into their systems and get some, in the case of Snowden, very, very high-level secret sensitive material. There's no evidence that Snowden got anywhere near the launch codes. But these are complex technological systems. And the insider threat is something that just can't be ruled out. Is there anything you want to add on that?
No. In addition to the British kind of command and control, I suppose you were just talking about other countries in answer to the question?
Oh, other countries?
Yeah.
To my knowledge, the Pakistanis, the Indians, the Chinese, the Israelis do not have their warheads mated to the delivery systems. Is that correct, as far as you know? You're not allowed to tell that?
No, I'm not 100% sure. Yeah.
So that leaves the French and the British, and the French system is probably similar to the British, but more elegant. Sorry.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you. As a follow-on, a few years ago, a story broke about how there was widespread cheating on some of these exams for the launch code commanders. And I was wondering what the atmosphere is like in these bases and whether they feel a little bored or demoralized. And is that putting us at a risk?
It's not good when you have launch officers who are cheating on their exams. We've had launch officers caught using illegal drugs. One was caught using ecstasy, which might not be so bad, that probably mellow that person out, but also using methamphetamines, and you don't want launch officers on methamphetamines. There has been a real morale problem in the Missile Corps. It has not been seen as a way of advancement within the Air Force. During the Cold War, to be an officer in charge of nuclear weapons was a very high status assignment, particularly in the era of the Strategic Air Command at its peak. Now it's considered a career dead end. The equipment is aging. A lot of the equipment is obsolete. And it is a real problem. I think it's less of a problem in terms of accidental launch of a missile than it is a problem in terms of an accident. You really want highly motivated, well-compensated, well-trained people around nuclear weapons.
Thank you. In 105 days, there'll be a new president in Washington. Based on your experience, what do you recommend to he or she to take, what policy should be taking for the 4 years they'll be running as president? And second, what do you think each one of them will actually do?
I think with one of the candidates, it's absolutely impossible to know what he will do. With the other candidate, Hillary Clinton was recorded secretly speaking about nuclear weapons at a fundraiser, and she raised some real questions about the logic of fully modernizing our arsenal. She raised questions about the need for a new cruise missile, which is a controversial program, and she spoke very highly of Secretary of Defense, former Secretary of Defense Bill Perry, who I mentioned earlier, who had an op-ed in the New York Times last week calling for an end to all of our land-based missiles because of the risk of accidental war that they pose. So we have some indication of what Hillary Clinton might want to do. I think that for the next president, I would want he or she for the United States to sign the nuclear test ban treaty. I would want he or she to resume serious arms negotiation with Russia and broaden the scope of arms negotiations so that China and other nuclear states were included, a greater emphasis on nuclear security, that is, to prevent nuclear terrorism. And I think moving away from this notion that nuclear weapons are symbols of power. One of the main themes of my book is that they're not symbols, they're machines. And they have to be treated that way. And the measurement of a country's greatness really shouldn't be how many nuclear weapons it has. It should be literacy, healthcare, all kinds of levels of education. Why do we have 7,000 nuclear weapons? When there were the first studies of a nuclear war plan, it was thought that with 150 to 200, we could completely annihilate the Soviet Union as a functioning society. And so 7,000. There's got to be a real questioning of the basic premises of our nuclear policy. And because the United States and Russia, between the two of us, have about 90% of all the nuclear weapons are possessed by these two countries, if these two countries really assume a leadership role in reducing the size of their arsenal and reducing the importance of nuclear weapons in their notions of national defense, I think that'll have a real impact. So that's what I hope our next president will do.
Got a question over here.
Hi. Dealing with the modernization that they passed as a deal with to get New START through the Senate, how much of that $1 trillion is a useful upgrade of our aging systems that are only safe through obsolescence, and how much of that is an unnecessary waste of taxpayer money that could be going to something more useful, or just perpetuating this system that is not actually making us much safer?
That is precisely the question that we need a vigorous national debate about. Because the nuclear triad as it exists today, which is submarine-based missiles, land-based missiles, and bombers with cruise missiles and gravity bombs, is a product of the Cold War. It came out of Cold War nuclear strategy. And the question is, how relevant is it in the 21st century? The one thing that I believe there must be immediate multi-billion-dollar investment in, that I support wholeheartedly, is investment in the command and control and early warning systems. That is of urgent importance. And then, you know, I'm not going to give a prescriptive answer about how many weapons we should have and whether we should preserve the triad, et cetera, but I feel like it really should be up to the proponents of this nuclear arsenal to make their case. How does it make us safer? And, you know, why do we have them? And one of the most important things that's rarely discussed is how would they be used in a war? So I've sort of skirted the answer, except to say I support a few $1 billion immediately on upgrading. I mean, the computers in our Minuteman launch complexes, and I was in one the other day. I was in one that had been decommissioned, but it was remarkably the same as the ones we have today. The computer that would get the emergency action message from the President of the United States is an IBM Series 1 computer, which was the height of technological excellence in 1976. And it's sort of incredible that that's, yeah. Oh, do you? Did you work with them?
Sure. My God, that's what they got in those.
Right now, as we sit here, the IBM Series 1, I'd love to talk to you about this because I'm writing about this right now. The IBM Series 1 will get the emergency action message through a landline.
Even other IBM systems since then are much better than that. That was a relic.
That's government.
Well,
it wasn't too long ago, by the way, that out in Aurora and in the whole flight system of our country, was it FFA or whoever, there were IBM machines that they had to keep making parts for because the federal government wouldn't get rid of them. Now they've since changed that, but this goes on all the time. They just don't get rid of stuff.
well, it's been much more glamorous to invest in fighter planes and high-tech weaponry, and the command and control systems, the communications systems, have been woefully underinvested in.
To what degree do you think the perpetuation of some of these systems is driven not by military strategy, but and the question is it make it safer, but by other interests, political or financial?
Well, Dwight Eisenhower gave his famous speech on the military-industrial complex upon leaving office, and that was because he was being attacked for being weak on defense, and he took enormous personal offense at that. And he didn't blame in the speech, but privately he blamed the companies that were manufacturing missiles and competing to provide missiles and were promoting the idea of a missile gap between the United States and the Soviet Union. So the notion of a military-industrial complex originated out of this nuclear arms race. There are still many billions of dollars to be made in the manufacture of ballistic missiles, of ballistic missile submarines, and of bombers. So I think that there is an economic interest still promoting these weapons in a way that may not be in the national interest. But when you look at the size of our military budget today, we'll spend $1 trillion over the next 30 years on nuclear weapons, and we'll spend more than $1 trillion in the next 2 years on conventional weapons. So I would argue that our military contractors will still have lots of things to do if we greatly reduce our spending on nuclear weapons. I think a greater proportion of the impetus for nuclear weapons comes from, and I'm not minimizing the lobbying that they do in Congress, but I think it comes more from this mentality that sees these weapons as symbols of our power and symbols of our strength, and not as a threat to our very existence.
You had mentioned earlier about between India and Pakistan,
about in a case of an accident of only just minutes to make a decision. One of the things that concerns me is a similar situation with North Korea, South Korea, and Japan. If North Korea was to do something just with a regular missile, that makes it look like something is happening, but it really isn't. And the US is going to be the one that's going to ultimately respond. But what are your views on that?
I think that's one of the most dangerous places in the world. And it's bad enough that North Korea has nuclear weapons, but the notion of South Korea and Japan having nuclear weapons as well, I think would make an unstable situation even more dangerous. There has to be pressure applied on North Korea, a country that cannot feed its own people, not to be diverting resources to the manufacture of long-range missiles and miniaturized nuclear weapons that can fit on those missiles. And China is going to be the country that's going to have to do it, and it really has to happen. And if it doesn't happen, there's a strong likelihood of a conflict of some sort, of a preemptive strike on North Korea to take out those weapons facilities, or North Korea using some of those weapons. And I mean, that is the last place in the world that you want to have possessing nuclear weapons and the ability to use them.
All right, any further questions? No. Eric, any final thoughts you want to leave everybody with?
Yeah. There's sort of a kind of a down energy in the room after this conversation. And I really would not be doing any of this if I thought it was hopeless and we were doomed. And certainly the time that I've now spent with these phenomenal people in their 80s and their 90s who are still concerned about this issue and still active on it. I mean, Bill Perry spoke the other night about during the Cuban Missile Crisis, he was an analyst in Washington who every night was going in there and looking under a magnifying glass at the the Soviet missiles in Cuba. And I spoke to Robert McNamara, who was former Secretary of Defense. These guys literally thought that they might die any day in a nuclear war. And their knowledge did not lead to a kind of a feeling of paralysis. It led to a desire to fight, to reduce the nuclear danger. Bill Perry's about to be 90 years old. He could have a much easier time of it playing golf or just sitting in the chair watching a good movie on TV. So I really hope that this subject and my presentation of it does not lead to despair, but leads to enough concern to do something. I guess that would be my concluding words.
Terrific. Well, hopefully we have not left you with despair and there's some more optimism just at the end.
And one last thing. If nothing else, it should encourage you to enjoy the rest of your evening.
On that note, please join me in thanking Eric Schlosser very much.
Thank you very much.